Christmas Eve, marble floors, and a husband who forgot who he married. The lobby of Meridian First Bank was decorated for Christmas. Gold garlands draped the columns. A towering tree stood near the entrance, wide lit, pristine, almost theatrical in its perfection. Soft orchestral carols floated from hidden speakers somewhere overhead, filling the space with the kind of warmth that belongs to another kind of life. A quieter one. A safer one. Elena Hartwell stood at the private banking counter on the second floor, her ivory wool coat buttoned carefully over the round, unmistakable curve of her 7-month belly. She moved the way women carry their pregnancies when they've learned to hold everything gently, her back straight, her chin level, one hand resting lightly at her side. Not for balance. More like a quiet prayer. She had come here with her husband. That part matters. Richard Hartwell stood 6 feet tall in a charcoal suit that had been tailored within the last month. His cologne, the one she had bought him for his birthday, arrived before he did in every room. He was handsome in the kind of way that always photographed well. And he knew it. He had always known it. But today, he was standing just slightly away from Elena. Not beside her, away from her. The senior banking associate, a woman named Patricia, had politely stepped aside to retrieve account documents. The moment she disappeared, behind the frosted glass partition, Richard turned. His voice was low, controlled, almost bored. "I need you to understand something," he said, not looking at her. "The account restructuring I filed, it's final. Your name is no longer listed. I've already spoken to legal." Elena turned to face him slowly. She didn't gasp. She didn't tremble. She simply looked at him the way a person looks when they already suspected something was true but still needed to hear the words to believe it. "Richard." Her voice was even. "I'm 7 months pregnant. I'm aware," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "That doesn't change the paperwork." And then, as if the universe itself wanted the moment documented, the doors on the far side of the lobby opened, and in walked Margaret Hartwell, Richard's mother. Impeccably dressed in a red coat as though she'd come to celebrate. Behind her was a woman Eleanor recognized, young, polished, familiar in the way that things you've been trying not to see eventually become impossible to ignore. Diana Chase. She worked in Richard's development company. She had attended their last 2 dinner parties. She had once hugged Elena at a company gala and complimented her earrings. She was now wearing a ring on her left hand. Not just any ring. Richard's grandmother's ring. The one he had told Elena was lost at sea during a sailing trip 3 years ago. Elena's eyes dropped to that ring, then rose slowly back to her husband's face. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply watched her understand. Long pause. Patricia returned from behind the partition, carrying a folder of documents. She smiled professionally and set them on the counter. Then glanced between the 3 of them with the carefully trained neutrality of someone who had seen enough private banking drama to write her own book. "Mr. Hartwell," Patricia said, her tone shifting very slightly. "Before we proceed with the restructuring request, I'll need to loop in our senior manager. There are some details regarding this account's primary holder that require his direct authorization." Richard frowned. "I'm the account holder. My name is on record." Patricia glanced briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Elena. "Yes, sir. And so is another name. One that carries a rather different level of authority over these accounts." Richard's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" Patricia smiled the way people smile when they know something powerful is about to happen, and they are simply holding the door open for it. "It means," she said quietly, "our branch manager will be right out." And that, right there, that was the moment the morning changed. Let it breathe. Because what Richard Hartwell did not know, what he had spent 7 years failing to discover, was that the woman standing beside him, the one whose name he had tried to erase from a document on Christmas Eve, the one carrying his child, the one he had invited his mistress to humiliate, had never been who he thought. She was not even close to understand what happened in that marble lobby on Christmas Eve. You have to go back not far, at first. Just 7 years. Eleanor Reyes, she had kept her own name professionally, though legally she had taken his, grew up in a modest home in Portland, Oregon. Raised by a grandmother who smelled of lavender and spoke 3 languages and made the best lemon cake east of the Pacific. Her mother had passed when Elena was 9. Her father had never quite recovered from the loss, and Elena had learned, early and efficiently, how to move through the world quietly and carry more than her share. She was not flashy. She was not loud. She had the kind of beauty that didn't announce itself, the kind that took people a second look to notice and a third look to fully appreciate. Dark hair, kept simply, as the color of strong coffee. Hands that were always doing something useful. She had been finishing her graduate degree in architectural design when a mutual friend introduced her to Richard Hartwell at a gallery opening in downtown Seattle. He had been 31. She had been 27. He had spotted her standing alone in front of a piece of industrial sculpture, head tilted, genuinely thinking about it rather than posing beside it for a photograph. He had said, "Most people pretend to understand modern art. You look like you actually do." She had turned to him and said, "I'm not sure anyone understands it. I think the honest ones just admit they're trying." He had laughed. A real laugh. The kind that came from somewhere unexpected. They talked for 2 hours that evening. About architecture and the arrogance of buildings that forgot about the people living inside them. About his family's real estate development company and how he wanted to build something that actually mattered. About her grandmother. About Portland fog and Seattle rain, and the strange way cities hold on to grief in their architecture. By the time the gallery closed, he had her number. By the following weekend, he had her attention. By the following month, he had, though neither of them would have used the word so quickly, her heart. He was good at it. In those early years, the courtship, the attention. Richard Hartwell, when he chose to turn his full focus on something, was magnetic. Elena had not been looking for that kind of magnetism, which, perhaps, made her more vulnerable to it rather than less. They dated for 2 years before he proposed. It was not a grand proposal. He had taken her to the coast or quiet stretch of the Oregon shore near where her grandmother had once lived, and they'd eaten fish and chips at a picnic table facing the water. And as the sun went down, he had simply set a ring on the table between them and said, "I'd like to build something permanent with you." She had cried, not from surprise but from the specific feeling of being seen. He had chosen that location because she had mentioned it once, months before, in passing. He had remembered. She said yes before he even finished the sentence. Their wedding was small by Hartwell family standards, which meant it was still large enough to feel slightly out of Elena's comfort zone. Margaret Hartwell had insisted on 200 guests. Richard had said the number was non-negotiable because of business relationships. Elena, who had wanted something intimate, had agreed, because she was learning, even then, how to fold her preferences quietly away. She moved into the Hartwell estate in Bellevue, a 7-bedroom house on a hillside with floor-to-ceiling windows and a kitchen she would have loved if she'd had more time to be in it. But in those first years of marriage, she was busy. She had taken a position at a mid-sized architectural firm in Seattle. She had taken on the role of hostess for Richard's business dinners with grace and intelligence. She had worked evenings and weekends when his projects required her input, because she understood development timelines and could translate complex design language into things investors understood. She became, quietly and without announcement, one of the most valuable informal advisors in his company. She received no credit for this. She received dinner conversation and his hand in hers at charity galas and the occasional weekend in a beautiful hotel, and for a long while she believed that was enough. The red flags, when she looks back now, were there. They were simply dressed in expensive clothes and good excuses. There was the time he dismissed her design input at a client meeting because, as he explained later, it throws off the dynamic when partners mix professionally in front of clients. She had nodded and accepted that. She was, after all, his wife first, not his colleague. There was the way his mother, Margaret, referred to Elena almost exclusively by her married name. Never Elena, always Mrs. Hartwell, as though she were a legal status rather than a person. There was the way Richard never corrected it. There was the company gala 3 years into the marriage where Diana Chase had appeared for the first time. A new hire. Marketing, client relations. Mid-20s, effortlessly put together, with a way of looking at Richard that Elena had noticed and quietly filed away. He had introduced them warmly. Diana had complimented Elena's earrings. There was the sailing trip the following autumn, during which Richard returned 4 days late, sunburned and quieter than usual, with a story about unexpected weather delays and a lost piece of family jewelry. Elena had not questioned it. She was already learning, by then, the particular exhaustion of questioning things she was not quite ready to know the answers to. There were the months when he began sleeping in the guest room because of early morning calls with international partners. There were the business trips that stretched from 3 days to a week. There was the New Year's Eve he spent at a company event she hadn't been invited to because, he said, it was for executives only, and then she'd seen Diana's name in a photograph someone posted online, standing in a group to people away from her husband, wearing a silver dress and laughing. Elena had looked at that photograph for a long time, and then she had closed her laptop and gone to make tea, because she was pregnant by then, newly, carefully, hopefully pregnant, and she had decided, in the way that women sometimes decide things they haven't yet said aloud, that she would wait. She would watch. She would learn everything she needed to know before she did a single thing. She had not been idle during that waiting. But we'll get to that. The pregnancy had not softened Richard. Elena had hoped, privately and perhaps naively, that it would. She had imagined, of a way you imagine things when you're still choosing hope over evidence, that a child might reawaken something in him. Some tenderness that used to be there. Some version of the man who had remembered where her grandmother lived and chosen a ringless, windswept picnic table over a candlelit restaurant because he'd actually been paying attention to her. That man, it turned out, had either never fully existed or had been slowly replaced so gradually that she hadn't noticed the substitution. By the time she was 5 months pregnant, Richard had stopped pretending about the late evenings. He came home past midnight twice a week and offered no explanation. He attended a series of weekend retreats for the development firm's senior leadership, retreats that Elena knew, through her own quiet research, had no formal schedule beyond a hotel block booking in Vancouver that included a room registered to Diana Chase. He had stopped asking about the baby's room, which Elena was slowly, lovingly designing herself. He had stopped attending prenatal appointments after the second one. He referred to the pregnancy in conversations as the situation, once, at a family dinner, in front of his mother, without appearing to notice what he'd said. Margaret had heard it and said nothing. Elena had heard it and said nothing too. But she had set down her fork very carefully and taken a slow sip of water and looked out the window at the winter garden. And something inside her, some last lingering thread of whatever she'd been holding onto, went very, very still. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, not via their family attorney, who Elena knew well, via courier service, in a manila envelope with a law firm's return address she'd never seen before, Kellerman and Voss, a Seattle firm that specialized, as she quickly discovered, in high-asset marital dissolution. She opened the envelope at the kitchen counter while her morning tea grew cold beside her. The documents were thorough. 12 pages. They cited irreconcilable differences. They proposed a financial settlement that was, on its surface, technically compliant with Washington state law, but only if one assumed, as the document clearly did, that Elena's personal assets were limited to the joint accounts Richard had established early in their marriage. The settlement offered her 18 months of spousal support at a figure that sounded generous until you understood what Richard's actual worth was. It included a standard custody framework for the child who had not yet been born, whose room Elena was still painting, that gave Richard primary legal decision-making authority. She read it twice, all 12 pages, without crying. Then she folded it neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and called Thomas Chen. Thomas Chen was 63 years old, semi-retired, and had been the personal legal counsel of Elena's late grandfather, Victor Reyes, for over 30 years. He had attended Victor's funeral. He had attended Elena's wedding. He had, at various points over the past 4 years, reached out quietly to Elena with paperwork she had signed without discussing with Richard. He was the kind of lawyer who understood that the most important work was often the work that happened in silence. "I received it," she said when he answered. A brief pause. Then, "How are you feeling?" Clear, she said. And she meant it. Good, Thomas said. We've been ready for 2 years. You know that, I know. Take your time. But don't wait too long. She didn't wait. 3 days after the papers arrived, Richard called her into the living room one evening after dinner. A dinner he had barely touched, and she had eaten slowly and carefully because she was 7 months along and the baby needed her to eat. And he sat across from her in the leather armchair that had always made him look like he was holding court. And he told her what he'd done. He laid it out in the careful language of a man who had rehearsed the development firm's future direction, the need for change in his personal life. Diana's role as aide, and here he chose the word deliberately, partner, in both business and personal terms, the practical nature of what needed to happen now. He did not apologize. He did not cry. He did not say Diana's name more than once, as though limiting its use would somehow keep it from becoming real between them. Elena sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to all of it. When he finished, she asked one question. Did you ever love me? He didn't answer immediately. The pause was long enough to be its own answer. I cared about you. He finally said, I still do. But caring isn't the same thing. She nodded slowly. No, she agreed. It isn't. She stood up carefully. Because 7 months of pregnancy makes standing up an act of deliberate intention, and she smoothed her sweater and she walked out of the living room. He called after her. Asked if she was going to sign the papers. She paused at the doorway. I'll be in touch, she said. And she walked upstairs and closed the door of the nursery behind her and stood in the middle of the half-painted room. Among the soft shadows and the smell of sage green paint, and the small unassembled crib in the corner, and she pressed both hands against her belly and she felt the baby move a slow, rolling turn, like a small creature finding comfort, and she allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to exhale. The family humiliation came the following weekend. Margaret Hartwell called a Sunday luncheon. She framed it as a family conversation, which was, Elena had learned, Margaret's language for a performance she had already choreographed. When Elena arrived, because leaving would have been easier, but arriving was evidence, and Elena had begun to understand the importance of evidence. She found not only Richard and Margaret but also two of Richard's adult cousins, a family friend who happened to be a local magistrate, and Diana Chase, seated at the family dining table as though she had been there for years. Elena sat down without a word. She accepted tea. She ate the food that was placed in front of her. She listened to Margaret address the room with the confident authority of a woman who had been performing competence since before Eleanor was born. At one point, Margaret turned to Eleanor with the particular smile that contains no warmth whatsoever, and said, of course, the practical reality is that once you're settled somewhere more appropriate for your situation, the transition for the baby will be quite manageable. Somewhere more appropriate, as though Eleanor were a tenant in her own life. I appreciate your input, Margaret, Elena said pleasantly. I'm sure the courts will find it interesting as well. Silence dropped across the table like a stone into still water. Richard looked up from his plate. Margaret's smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted. Diana looked at her coffee cup. Elena sipped her tea. She was the calmest person in the room. And that, she knew, was the most frightening thing she could be. That night, Elena drove. She didn't plan a destination. She simply got into her car, the practical navy blue sedan she'd chosen over the sports car Richard had offered to buy her 3 years ago. Because she preferred things that were built for reliability over things that were built to impress. And she drove out of the Bellevue neighborhood, past the glowing windows of houses full of people living ordinary lives, and out toward the highway that ran alongside the lake. It had begun to rain, not dramatically. The quiet kind of winter rain that Seattle does so well, steady and patient, and everywhere. The kind that doesn't announce itself but simply settles in and stays. She pulled off the highway at a small overlook she had discovered years ago, during the early months of her marriage, when she used to drive on evenings when things felt too large to carry inside four walls. The lake spread out below her, dark and vast and entirely unconcerned with the problems of people. The rain tapped softly against the roof of the car. She turned off the engine. She sat there in the silence and she let herself feel it. All of it. The full weight of what had happened over the past weeks, over the past years, really. If she was being honest. and she was trying very hard now to be honest. She pressed her palms flat against her belly and she felt the baby shift. A soft, insistent nudge against her ribs, a small living thing reminding her of its presence with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. "I know," she whispered, "I know. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something you had, but from finally acknowledging something you'd been slowly losing without allowing yourself to notice." Elena sat with that grief in the rain soft dark and gave it its proper name. She had loved Richard Hartwell. Not perfectly, she could see that now, but genuinely. She had folded herself into the architecture of his life with the kind of care she gave to every structure she designed. Attending to load-bearing walls and sight lines, and the way light moved through spaces at different times of day. She had made it beautiful. She had made it livable. And he had handed it to someone else without blinking. She thought about the woman Diana Chase was. Young and ambitious, and perhaps not entirely aware, or perhaps entirely aware and choosing it anyway, of which she was participating in. Helena found she did not, in this quiet moment, have the energy for hatred. Hatred was heavy and she was already carrying enough. What she felt instead, underneath the grief, was something harder and cleaner. Resolution. She thought about her grandmother. About the way that woman had built an entire life from patience and intelligence and the kind of quiet strategic thinking that never announced itself because it didn't need to. She thought about her grandfather Victor, who had built a real estate portfolio across 3 states over 40 years and had, in his final years, arranged his legacy with the kind of meticulous care that only people who truly understand what they're building ever achieve. Victor Reyes had died when Eleanor was 23. He had left her everything, not because she was his only grandchild, but because she was the one who had spent summers sitting beside him in his study, learning the language of balance sheets and trust structures and the quiet architecture of wealth. He had never told her brothers. He had never told her father. He had told Elena, and only Elena, and he had made her promise to protect it wisely and to never let anyone devalue her. The value of a thing, he had once told her, is determined by who knows what it is. She had kept her promise. For 7 years of marriage she had kept her promise. Thomas Chen had helped her keep it through an architecture of legal structures, so careful and so thorough that even Richard's team of lawyers who were, she now knew, actively looking had found nothing of consequence, because they had been looking for Eleanor Hartwell's assets. They had not been looking for Eleanor Reyes Holdings, LLC, established 9 years ago under her personal trust, with board positions held by Thomas Chen and 2 other trustees, managing a portfolio of commercial real estate development interests. And yes, the series of accounts at Meridian First Bank that made the joint marital accounts look like a child's piggy bank. She had not hidden this to deceive him. She had hidden it because her grandfather had taught her to. Because the world was full of people who would look at what you had and try to determine what portion of it they deserved. Because love should not have to be negotiated against an asset list. She had simply never found a reason to show him. And then he had given her a very clear reason not to. The baby moved again. A long, slow ripple, the whole round curve of her belly shifting with it. A quiet tide. Elena leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes and listened to the rain and breathed. "We're going to be fine," she said aloud. To the baby, to herself, to the rain. "We are going to be absolutely fine." Her phone lit up on the passenger seat. A text from Thomas. "He filed to freeze the joint accounts this afternoon. Meridian is reviewing. I've notified our manager contact. The appointment stands for Christmas Eve." She read it twice. Then she smiled slowly, privately. The way you smile when you've been holding a card for a very long time, and you know that the moment to lay it down is nearly here. She started the car. The wipers swept across the windshield, clearing the rain for one clean second before it gathered again. She drove home through the quiet, wet city. Narrator pause. Dropped voice slightly. But what Richard Hartwell did not know, what none of them knew, not Margaret, not Diana, not the lawyers at Kellerman and Voss, would change every single thing. Thomas Chen had been practicing law for 38 years. He had handled mergers. He had navigated trust disputes between families who had stopped speaking. He had sat across from partners dissolving businesses that had taken lifetimes to build. He had developed, over nearly 4 decades, a very particular skill, the ability to remain completely calm in the presence of oncoming storms because he had built the shelter before the weather changed. Elena had called him the evening after Victor's funeral 9 years ago, and she had said, "I need to understand what he left me, all of it, and I need to understand how to protect it." Thomas had said, "Good. I've been waiting for you to ask." What followed over the next several years was a quiet, methodical process of structuring Elena's inheritance in a way that protected it from any future legal claim, including, once she married, a spousal claim. Washington was a community property state, which meant that assets brought into a marriage before it began, if properly documented, remained separate property. Victor's bequest, as substantial and carefully documented, remained Elena's alone. The trust structure Thomas built was a thing of quiet elegance. Elena Reyes Holdings, LLC, Delaware registered company with Elena's personal trust as the sole member, held the real estate interests. A separate investment vehicle, established before the wedding, managed the liquid assets. The Meridian accounts, which had existed since Elena was 25, had been opened under her maiden name and her personal trust's tax ID. They were not joint accounts. They had never been joint accounts. They were, in the very specific legal language that mattered, entirely hers. The portfolio had grown considerably in the 7 years since her wedding. Elena had not been passive with it. She had used her architectural training and her understanding of development cycles to make careful, well-timed investments. She had sat on the board of one of Portland's most successful commercial property developers quietly, as a silent board member, in a role that required her presence 4 times a year and her attention always. She had made 7 significant real estate transactions in the past decade, each one timed with the patience of someone who understood that the greatest returns come to those willing to wait. Richard's development company, which he ran with considerable noise and confidence, was worth approximately $42 million on paper. Much of that was leveraged and mortgaged against future projects, tied up in pending contracts, fragile in the way that aggressively expanded businesses often are. Elena Reyes Holdings had a net asset value of just over $89 million. Liquid accounts at Meridian First Bank, $11.7 million. She had never mentioned any of this to Richard. Not once. Not because she had planned this ending. She hadn't, not in the beginning. Not even in the middle years when the red flags multiplied. She had simply honored her grandfather's teaching. She had kept what was hers. She had maintained her own structure while living inside his. And now that his structure was collapsing, now that he had set lawyers and careers and divorce papers in motion, now that he had brought Diana Chase to the family table and presented her with his grandmother's ring, Elena Reyes Holdings was standing exactly where it had always been, waiting. Thomas had spent the week before Christmas Eve in careful communication with Meridian's legal department. The attempted account freeze Richard had filed applied to the joint marital accounts which, as it happened, held less than $200,000. A figure that represented Richard's contributions from the shared expenses of their married life. Standard, expected, the kind of account a spouse might reasonably have access to. The Meridian accounts held under Elena's trust were a different category entirely. Different account tier, different department, different manager. James Whitfield, senior manager of Meridian's private wealth division, had known Elena Reyes since she was 25 years old and had walked into his branch with a letter of introduction from Thomas Chen and a portfolio summary that had made him sit up very straight in his chair. He had managed her accounts personally for 9 years. He had never, in all that time, received a single instruction from anyone named Richard Hartwell regarding those accounts, because Richard Hartwell had never been told they existed. When Thomas called James on December 23rd and explained the situation, the divorce filing, the attempted freeze, the account restructuring request Richard planned to present at the branch the following morning, James listened carefully and said only, "I understand. We'll handle it properly." And that was all he needed to say. On Christmas Eve morning, Elena dressed carefully. She chose the ivory wool coat, the one that fit over her belly with quiet grace, and her good boots, and the small gold earrings her grandmother had left her. She pulled her dark hair back neatly. She wore no jewelry other than the earrings. She had taken off Richard's rings, the wedding band, and the engagement ring. A beautiful thing she had once loved, and placed them in the velvet box on the dresser, where they would remain. She studied herself in the mirror for a moment. 7 months and 2 weeks pregnant, clear-eyed. She thought about her grandmother standing in a small kitchen in Portland making lemon cake for a funeral, completely composed. Because grief and function were not mutually exclusive, she thought about Victor Reyes, who had once told her that the most powerful position in any room was the one no one knew you were in. She picked up her phone and texted Thomas, "On my way." His response was immediate: "James is ready." She drove to the bank. Richard arrived 3 minutes after she did, with Margaret beside him. Margaret had insisted on attending, had framed it as emotional support, though Elena understood it was something closer to supervision, and Diana Chase, who stood in the lobby with the ring on her hand, and the particular expression of someone performing confidence they don't entirely feel. Elena greeted no one. She simply walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the second floor, and waited. When Richard arrived beside her at the private banking counter and Patricia went to retrieve James Whitfield, Elena stood with her hands folded lightly over her belly, and she looked out through the glass at the Christmas tree in the lobby below, and she thought, not for the first time that week, that everything was exactly as it should be. James Whitfield was the kind of man who wore his authority quietly. He was 60, silver-haired, and hurried. He had the bearing of someone who had spent a career navigating the fortunes of other people without ever becoming intoxicated by proximity to them. He came through the frosted glass door with the measured steps of someone who was not in a hurry. Because he didn't need to be. He looked at Elena first. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said warmly, and then, with the smallest correction, the one that only Elena noticed, "Miss Reyes." "Mr. Whitfield," she said. "Thank you for making time on the holiday." "Of course," he said. He turned then to Richard, and his expression became professional in the way that carries a distinct and important message, polite, but not deferential. "Mr. Hartwell, I understand you've submitted a restructuring request regarding the joint marital accounts." "That's right," Richard said. His tone had the calibrated confidence of a man who had never been told no by a bank in his life. "I need my wife's authorization removed and the account transferred to my sole ownership. Given that we're in separation proceedings, this is standard." "I see," James said. He set a folder on the counter. "We've reviewed the joint accounts and can certainly process that request through our standard separation protocol. But I need to clarify something before we proceed." He opened the folder, placed his sets of documents on the counter, side by side. "The joint marital accounts you're referring to," he said, "are here." He indicated the left set. "Current balance, $187,000. Those will proceed to separation review per your filing." Richard nodded once, beginning to reach for the pen. "However," James said, and his voice did not change in pitch or tempo, but something in the room did, something atmospheric and irreversible. "These are not the accounts that require your attention today." He indicated the right set of documents. Richard looked at them. On the top page, embossed with the Meridian Private Wealth seal, was a name: Eleanor Reyes Holdings, LLC Private Trust Account, Primary Authorization Holder, Eleanor Reyes Hartwell. "These accounts," James continued, "exist entirely outside the joint marital structure. They were established 9 years ago under Miss Reyes's personal trust and have been managed under our private Wealth division since their inception. They are separate property under Washington state law, predating the marriage by 2 years." He paused. "Let that settle. They are not subject to the restructuring request you filed. They are not subject to any marital asset claim. They exist, Mr. Hartwell, entirely outside the scope of your legal filing." Richard stared at the document. Pause. The marble lobby suddenly felt very still. Margaret, who had positioned herself nearby enough to hear, had stopped moving. Patricia, behind the counter, found something fascinating to study on her computer screen. "What is this?" Richard said slowly. It was not quite a question. "This," James said, "is your wife's account." "How?" much, Richard started. The specifics of Miss Reyes's account are confidential and are not information I'm at liberty to share with you, James said. What I can tell you is that the account is active. The holdings are substantial. And Miss Reyes has full and exclusive authority over all decisions regarding it. He turned to Elena. His expression softened by a degree that was visible and intentional. Miss Reyes, is there anything you'd like to address or request on your accounts today? Elena looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the folder. Her folder. 9 years of careful and quiet work represented in paper and figures, and the name her grandfather had given her, and she spoke calmly and with absolute precision. Please confirm the account freeze request filed by Mr. Hartwell's legal team has been denied. It has been denied, James confirmed. The accounts fall outside the scope of the filing. Please confirm that my separate property designation has been formally documented for use in any proceedings, confirmed and ready for transfer to your legal counsel. And please confirm, she said, that any future requests made on my accounts by any party other than Thomas Chen or myself will require my explicit written authorization. That instruction is already on file and has been for 9 years, James said. It will remain so. Thank you. Elena said. She closed the folder in front of her. She straightened her coat over her belly. She gathered her bag. And then she did the thing that, of all the things that happened in that marble lobby on Christmas Eve, Richard Hartwell would later say he could not stop thinking about. She turned to look at him. Not with anger, not with triumph, not with the kind of expression that performs victory for an audience. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they are choosing to leave behind, quietly, finally. With the particular peace that comes only after a very long and difficult journey toward a decision you should have made sooner. Richard, she said. Her voice was level and clear. Thomas will be in contact with your legal team this week. I'd recommend telling them to be thorough. She glanced briefly, just briefly, at Margaret. Margaret, who had managed and maneuvered and performed authority in every room she'd ever entered, stood entirely still for the first time that Elena could ever remember. Elena did not look at Diana. Not because she hadn't noticed her, not because she was afraid to, but because Diana Chase did not exist in the architecture of what mattered here. Elena Reyes had built something. She had protected it. She had brought it intact through 7 years, and a pregnancy and a marriage that had asked her to make herself smaller at every turn, and she had instead kept building, quietly. In rooms no one knew she was in. She buttoned the top button of her ivory coat. She turned toward the elevator. Behind her, she heard Richard say her name. Once, Helena. She pressed the elevator button. She heard it again. Helena. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. Pause, long pause. Let silence fill the space. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was James Whitfield, standing at the private banking counter in his quiet authority, watching her go and offering the briefest, most professional of nods. She nodded back. The doors closed. She exhaled. Beneath her hands, through the wool of her coat, she felt the baby move again, a long, confident roll, an entire small body shifting into a new position, settling in. She smiled. The week between Christmas and the New Year moved with the particular quiet that comes after something large has shifted. Richard's legal team at Kellerman and Voss, who had built their entire settlement strategy on the assumption that Elena's assets were limited to the joint accounts and the spousal support calculation, received Thomas Chen's initial filing on December 27. Thomas later described the phone call from their lead counsel as educational for everyone involved. The filing was careful and complete. It documented Elena's separate property holdings in full, with 9 years of meticulous records establishing that every asset under Elena Reyes Holdings had been acquired, managed, and grown entirely outside the marital estate. It included the trust documentation, the account establishment records, and a letter from Victor Reyes's estate attorney confirming the inheritance transfer that had occurred prior to the marriage. It also included, attached as an appendix, a document that Kellerman and Voss had not anticipated 3 years into the marriage. Thomas had advised Elena to retain a record of every professional contribution she had made to Richard's development company, every design consultation, every client meeting she had hosted, every investor presentation she had prepared or assisted with. He had suggested she document her time and expertise the way a contractor would. She had done so, quietly, in a running log that now spans several hundred pages. The total value of her undocumented professional contributions to Hartwell development, assessed by a third-party consulting firm Thomas had commissioned 6 months earlier, came to $4.2 million. It was not a demand. Thomas had structured it not as an aggressive claim, but as a statement of fact, offered as part of the full financial picture of the marriage. What was done with it was up to the courts and to the parties, but it changed the conversation. Richard's revised settlement proposal arrived via Thomas's office on December 30th. It was substantially different from the original 12-page document Elena had received by courier in November. The spousal support figure had been revised upward significantly. The custody framework had been completely reworked to reflect shared legal decision-making. The original language about primary authority was gone. Thomas called Elena when it arrived. "Dave, come down from the ceiling," he said. "Good," she said. "Tell them I'll review it. What are your thoughts so far?" She was sitting in the nursery when he called. The room was finished now, sage green walls, warm wood furniture, a small mobile of hand-painted moons turning gently above the crib. She had painted the last wall herself on the 28th. In the quiet of the morning, moving carefully around the furniture, music playing softly from her phone. "My thoughts," she said, looking around the room she had built for her daughter. She knew now it was a daughter. Had known for months that the custody terms are the only terms that truly matter. The rest is arithmetic. "That's what I thought you'd say," Thomas said. "I'll tell them." The negotiation continued through January. Richard, who had initially approached the dissolution with the confidence of a man holding all the cards, was now negotiating without that confidence and without, it had to be said, the complete support of his own legal team, who were quietly revising their understanding of the case with every document Thomas produced. Margaret Hartwell called Elena once, in the second week of January. Elena answered because she had promised herself she would not hide from anything. "I didn't know," Margaret said, and for the first time in 7 years, her voice held no performance in it. Just something quieter and less certain. "About the extent of your I didn't understand." "I know you didn't," Elena said. "You were working with the information you had." A silence. "The baby," Margaret started. "My daughter will know her father's family if they choose to be present in a way that is good for her," Elena said. "That's all I have to say about that. Right now." She said it without cruelty, without the desire to wound. She meant it exactly as she said it, as a conditional, as a door left open rather than closed. Because her daughter deserved the freedom to know all of her people and make her own determinations. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You are not what I thought you were." "No," Elena agreed. "I'm not." She ended the call and went back to what she had been doing, sitting at the kitchen table with a warm cup of tea and her grandfather's old ledger open in front of her. The worn leather one he'd let her practice writing numbers in when she was 7, tracing the columns with one finger the way she had as a child, remembering the shape of everything he'd built and everything he'd left her. "The value of a thing," he had said, "is determined by who knows what it is." She knew what she was. She had always known. The baby arrived on February 9th, at 11:23 in the morning, in a private room at Swedish Medical Center in Seattle. Carol was there, Elena's friend of 12 years. The woman who had stood beside her at the wedding and had shown up without being asked to help paint the nursery and had driven her to prenatal appointments and had never once said "I told you so," though she would have been completely entitled to say it. Carol held Elena's hand through the whole of it, and when the baby arrived, red-faced and indignant and perfect, Carol cried before Elena did. Elena named her Rosalind. Rosalind Reyes Hartwell. The first name from the Shakespeare play her grandmother had loved, the middle name from the family that had given her everything she needed to stand. Richard was notified. He came to the hospital the following morning, formally and quietly, and he held his daughter for 20 minutes in the chair by the window, and Elena watched him, the real him. The version that existed without performance, without strategy. Hold this small new person, and she saw something on his face that she couldn't quite name. Something that might, in another life, have been who he could have been. She didn't say anything about it. It wasn't hers to address. He left after an hour. He thanked her, which surprised her. She nodded, which was all there was to say. The settlement was finalized in March. Elena's terms on custody were met in full as shared legal decision-making. Primary physical placement with Elena. A visitation structure that prioritized Rosalind's stability and well-being above the adults. Convenience. The financial terms were fair and thoroughly documented. And while Elena did not emerge from the settlement as anything other than what she had always been, a woman with her own wealth, her own structure, her own foundation, she emerged, having protected what mattered. Richard and Diana's engagement became public in April. Elena saw it in passing, the social post shared by someone on the periphery of their mutual acquaintance circle. And she paused on it for approximately 3 seconds and then kept scrolling. She had moved out of the Bellevue house in January, into a renovated Craftsman in a quieter neighborhood across the lake, the house she had actually selected and purchased 2 months before the divorce papers arrived. Through an agent Thomas had recommended, funded entirely by her own accounts. It had large windows and a good kitchen and a backyard with an old apple tree and a room that would serve as a studio for the architectural consulting work she had returned to full-time. After Rosalind's first month, she had taken her name back, professionally in full. Elena Reyes. It had always fit better. The small gold earrings from her grandmother she wore almost every day. The rings from Richard she had not looked at again after leaving them on the dresser. She'd asked Carol to collect them, and Carol had taken them, and whatever happened to them after that was a story Elena had no part in. There was a morning. Rosalind was 6 weeks old when Elena sat in the rocking chair by the window in the nursery at 5 in the morning, feeding her daughter in the blue dark quiet before dawn, and the apple tree in the backyard was covered in a very late frost, each branch laced in white, perfectly still in the cold air. She looked at her daughter's face, Rosalind, awake and calm and studying the world with the focused intensity of someone with enormous amounts to learn, and she thought about the woman she was. The woman she had always been, even before she knew how to name it. She thought about standing in a marble lobby on Christmas Eve with her hands folded over her belly, in an ivory wool coat, while a man who had underestimated her stood in the wreckage of his own assumptions. She thought about the rain on the overlook by the lake, the baby's small kick in the dark of the car. She thought about her grandfather's voice. The value of a thing is determined by who knows what it is. She knew. She had always known. And now there was Rosalind, who would grow up knowing to pause. Long, warm, final pause. Elena Reyes rocked her daughter in the blue dark morning and watched the frost on the apple tree and thought, this is what winning looks like, not a courtroom, not a boardroom, not a marble floor with witnesses, not a public moment designed for someone else's shocked out. This, a rocking chair, a frosted tree, a daughter learning the weight and warmth of the person who would protect her for the rest of her life. This is what it looks like to have built something real. This is what it looks like to have kept what was yours. People asked Elena later, friends, colleagues, her cousin who called from Portland when the word got out, whether she had planned it from the beginning, whether the hidden accounts were a long game she'd been playing against him. She always answered the same way. She said, I built what my grandfather taught me to build. I protected what my family gave me. I didn't build it against Richard. I built it regardless of him. There's a difference between those two things that matters enormously. A woman who builds her strength in order to defeat someone is still building in reaction to someone else. A woman who builds her strength because she understands its value, because she was taught to see herself clearly and never talk herself out of what she knows, that woman is building from a place no one can reach. Richard Hartwell married a woman he thought he understood. He saw a quiet person and he read quietness as smallness. He saw patience and read it as passivity. He saw someone who absorbed difficulty without complaint and decided that meant she had no limits. He had been wrong about every single one of those things. The bank manager had disagreed. The paperwork had disagreed. The 9 years of careful, consistent, intelligent work had disagreed. Rosalind Reyes in her crib, under her mobile of hand-painted moons. In the house her mother had chosen and paid for and made beautiful, would grow up learning the language her great-grandfather had taught. Not the language of revenge, Not the language of scorekeeping or warfare or the bitter arithmetic of who wronged whom and how much it cost. The language of value. The language of knowing exactly who you are. The language of building something real, protecting it with patience and intelligence, and the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to announce what they had because the structure itself already said everything. And on Christmas morning, the morning after the marble lobby, the morning after James Whitfield had opened a folder and placed his sets of documents on a counter and said, however, Helena had woken in the early light and lain in bed with her hands on her belly and listened to the frost's quiet morning and thought, here we are, not broken, not diminished, not starting over, just arrived, finally, fully, irrevocably arrived at the version of her life that was entirely her own. She had done what her grandfather asked. She had kept what was hers. She had known what she was worth before anyone else was given the chance to tell her otherwise. And when the moment came when the bank manager came through the frosted glass door with a folder and a quiet certainty, she had been ready. She had been ready for years. The value of a thing is determined by who knows what it is. Eleanor Reyes knew exactly. She always had.